All right, hello, welcome. I hope you're well rested after the lunch break. My name is Christoph, and I've been working in software development for almost 20 years now. And I'm very invested in the intersection between tech and social justice. In his latest book, The Designing for a Better World, Don Norman, one of the main advocates for user-centered design, wrote that design must change from being unintentionally destructive to being intentionally constructive, repairing what's gone wrong, collaborating with marginalized voices, and sustain the Earth's limited resources. And not all of you here are designers by trade. But we all shape the world around us using the skills and tools that we have. In some ways or another, we are all designers. We all bear this responsibility. And with this in mind, I'd like to give you an introduction into designing for vulnerable groups, which will include a brief discussion about accessibility and inclusive design. And to illustrate this a little bit better, I brought a case study in form of the Find Me project. I was a UX designer for the project in the summer of 2016. So we were a cross-functional, agile team working from the ThoughtWorks office in the UK. And our plan was to build an app to reunify children who got separated from their parents back with their relatives in Kakuma. So here's the first question: what is Kakuma? This is Kakuma. Kakuma is a refugee camp in Kenya, established in 1991, housing around 200,000 refugees, most of them from South Sudan. It was established to host unaccompanied minors who had fled the war in Sudan and from camps in Ethiopia, the so-called lost children, and then grew over time with the conflicts in the region. Today, there are still close to 13,000 unaccompanied minors in this camp. Children who are sent by their relatives to find refuge alone, or children whose relatives went back to the war zones and left them behind. The idea for the project came from the Belgian filmmaker Lieven Korthuis, who spent 5 years on and off in Kakuma and created a documentary about it. It is called The Invisible City, and you can still find it online if you are interested about Kakuma and what's going on there. So to kick all of this off, we met in Brussels to get his expertise on the conditions and people in Kakuma, so we could slowly create a first understanding and generate some insights. And of course, we knew that we couldn't rely on the observations of just one man, and that everything we worked on was just a hypothesis, later to be confirmed with people currently living in Kakuma and other experts like the UNHCR and the Red Cross, who operated in that camp. So, since we already knew that the problem was children being separated from their families, we asked the question, all right, children separated from the family, but who are our users? The standard question of every UX designer before starting a project. And it wasn't really easy for us to get into this because we were not from Africa, we were not familiar with the continent and not the countries surrounding Kakuma. So we needed some demographic research first. and something that I would advise to you even if you think you know who your users are. So in the case of Kakuma, we found that there is a mix of nationalities, languages, and religions. And nationalities presented here were a mix of Somalian, Ethiopian, Ugandan, Rwandan, South Sudanese, and 19 further nationalities. So this might already be a very diverse group of people in one spot, but you need to remind yourself that the country lines are colonial constructs, meaning that what is just like a handful of countries to us is filled with multiple ethnic groups. These 5 countries represent 25 main ethnic groups, and there are numerous smaller ethnic groups. I think Ethiopia alone counts around 80 if you want to go really deep. That means 80 different cultures, probably languages, and so on and so forth. So this already was a very daunting task for us to kind of figure out who our users were in there. And we had to remind ourselves to not paint with a too broad of a European brush. So over half of the refugees were from South Sudan, and given the prevalence of unaccompanied minors in this group, we decided that the prime focus would be their refugees. And at the same time, South Sudan's civil war flared up again, what meant that every day new children would arrive, a lot without a guardian, which put a lot of pressure and a sense of urgency on our team right from the start. So from the South Sudanese, we chose the Nuer people, who made up the majority of South Sudanese in the camp. And it's important to point out that there was also a minority of Dinka, which were the other party in the civil war. So it was very clear to not see the South Sudanese as a monolith. So we could be more sensitive in this tense area as far as we could manage. So back to the kickoff in Brussels. From interviewing Levin and having Skype calls with his contacts in the camp, we gained following key insights. As you can see here, there was a low level of literacy and technical ability for South Sudanese and refugees. Refugees are usually familiar with SMS-based services such as M-Pesa, which is a banking system. Unaccompanied children often arrive in a guardianship arrangement, so a woman would take care if she sees some other kids along the way and take them with her. Smartphone usage is growing in the camp, and everybody knows someone with a smartphone. Facebook and WhatsApp are popular among smartphone users. Alternative attachment figures are also valuable as parents. And the last one was especially interesting, since it highlighted one of our many Western biases that we uncovered ourselves. Because the project started with the goal of reunifying kids with their parents, meaning their mother or their father. But we found out that it wasn't unusual to have other family ties taking care of the kids, usually called uncles or aunties, no matter what their family relation from the Western perspective actually would be. Sometimes they wouldn't even be blood related, but would have a similar importance than we in the West would say about the mother and the father. One of the many reminders to consistently check our own assumptions, even about things that we might find basic. So the part with the smartphone use was very important for us when we decided which technology to use. Because first we thought about a system relying on old Nokia phones, which were abundant in the camp. So this was our first sketch. Knowing that smartphones were available, though, opened up a whole new area and made us to decide to pivot towards a web app instead. So in all our discussions around creating this app, the aspect of vulnerability was a very serious topic. So it is fundamental to recognize that designing for vulnerability doesn't mean exclusively designing for the disabled, which would be the field of accessibility, and about that a little bit later. Very broadly speaking, vulnerable users are those who are considered to be more exposed to harm than others, or in need of added support. You can see these categories are very broad, and you need to figure out what that means for your context you're operating in. And the concept of vulnerability in design is borrowed from crisis centers, who assess the impact of catastrophes like ecological and environmental disasters on a population. Or it's used in social work, where it is used to assess the situation of their clients. It is important to note that not all people in this category would self-identify as such, and can perceive being labeled as vulnerable as insulting. So keep in mind to not come across as paternalistic when working with people who you think would fit this category. So depending on what your goal is, there are multiple ways to define this vulnerability. They can contain some of these categories: physical, mental and cognitive, emotional, social, and economic. When we talk about the people who would interact with our Find Me project, we created a few personas to see where they would fit in with this and other needs that we had around designing. So for those not in the know, personas are representation archetypes of certain important user groups. And the two most important we identified was obviously first the kids, but also the people who would chaperone the process. People who would start collecting the data that we would need it for the Find Me app, adults. And while we wanted to serve the needs of the children, the facilitators would be our actual users. After we went through this, we looked for our primary users through the lens of vulnerability. And as you can see here, we found some possibilities of vulnerability for our two main personas. So there are obvious ones that both share, like being refugees, depending on the Red Cross, or maybe experiencing PTSD from their flight experience, but also some more particular, like the kid having physical vulnerability by being small and weak. Something that you might just assume, take for granted, and then forget when you get on the designing. So even those obvious things, like, yes, that's a small child, it's a weak individual, should be noted. For the facilitator, there might be something around emotional labor, emotional vulnerability, since he, as we envisioned him, would be a leader in that community, somebody who knows how to move between people who might not feel the best intentions towards each other. So there would be more emotional stress delivered on that person. So we also needed to factor this in. So with these vulnerabilities in mind, we brainstormed possible scenarios which could endanger the two main personas. With the help of our expert, we then discussed the impact and probability of those scenarios. And we used this matrix to see where our ideas might fit. For instance, trouble with gangs inside of Kakuma, challenges with locals outside the camp, problems with food availability, malaria outbreaks. All of these things were things that could happen in Kakuma. So having laid them out with these in mind, we then sorted for the highest impact and probability when building out the responses and processes that were needed to enable the app in Kakuma, thus laying the groundwork for inclusive design. And what is that? So inclusive design is a design methodology that enables and draws on the full range of human diversity. It enables people of all backgrounds and abilities. It may address accessibility, age, economic situation, geographic location, language, race, and more. And since inclusive design is a very new discipline, there are many different definitions and principles making the rounds. I just chose one that I found very illustrative. All of these are trying to capture the essence of designing for vulnerability and at the same time addressing special needs. So the Inclusive Design Research Center identifies 3 principles about what inclusive design should be or should do. Recognize, respect, and design with human uniqueness and variability. That would be one principle. Second, use inclusive, open, and transparent processes and co-design with people who represent a diversity of perspectives. And third, realize that you are designing in a complex adaptive system where change in a design will influence the larger system that utilizes it. These 3 principles already are a good step towards thinking about what inclusive design can be, but because in the end, you will have to figure out for your project what inclusive design means to you in that context. I would also add a very important point in my mind is recognize that we all have biases and blind spots. So we need to factor exercises into our processes to shine a light on these things that we otherwise would not actively be able to address. So back to the Find Me project. With the principles of inclusive design in mind, we first created a vision statement for our product. And I brought it with me because I think it's very illustrative for the spirit behind inclusive design. So we built this app to help refugees in Kakuma find missing relatives through a web application with which refugees are both involved in designing and, by its design, are given choice and self-determinism. So it was very important for us to establish the connection to the refugees in Kakuma. Leven, our product owner, gave us a good start, but getting information directly from those affected was mission critical. Furthermore, from what we knew at the time, we formulated 3 guiding principles for the Find Me app. Starting with this one, child safety is paramount. Minimize human interaction, only store necessary data, secure data storage. Community-led, community-driven. Concept originated in the community to facilitate the data entry, and the idea will spread through word of mouth and through community establishments. And the last big principle was this one, keep it simple. Limited data capture validation, engaging simple user interface, technology and services in line with Kakuma capabilities. So the last part, very important, because we need to remind ourselves we're dealing with a refugee camp. Yes, there's Wi-Fi, yes, there's smartphones, but there are still limits. So I advise creating such principle at the beginning of your product delivery to capture the direction you would like to go while developing, so that you can refer back to these whenever you're making difficult, tough decisions. So how did we envision this should work? So we imagined 3 simple steps. Relatives who are looking for lost children and children who got lost would register. An algorithm, not unlikely that of a dating app, would match these people. A match them would lead to a verification step to make sure that the match was correct and the right people connected. After the first inception of this idea, I created a clickable prototype so that we could have a fast turnaround with feedback from folks in Kakuma. So to keep true to our principles of on-the-ground involvement, we trained some contacts in Kakuma via Skype to do usability testings and gave them a test script. And we started with the test of the data entry journey. And after a time, they came back to us, and yeah, they presented us the results. And here we started to find the first challenges for inclusive design. So they tested with different people from different areas, and while the Somali, Congolese, and Ethiopians we tested with could finish this journey, the South Sudanese would enter the first 2 fields and then give back the phone to the facilitator. First, we were confused about this behavioral pattern, because it was a pattern. We could see that happening over again, the first and then handing over the phone. So we finally got to the ground that since this particular group of users wasn't familiar with smartphone interaction patterns, they weren't aware that swiping up would give them more of the screen. So they only saw the top of our form field and thought, hey, I've done what you asked, and gave it back to us. Having learned that, and as a response, I broke down the form into small chunks that would fit the screen, 1 data point at a time. I eliminated some more visual noise from the UI, thus streamlining it a little bit more, and we tried in a little bit more of easier English. These are all usability features to make an app more accessible. But if you talk about accessibility as a discipline, this goes 1 step further. So when it comes to accessibility, we mean accommodating different types of disability. If we want to have a guidance for that, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are the worldwide most comprehensive collection of rules and standards centered around these main types of disabilities that you can see here: visual impairment and blindness, hearing impairment and deafness, motor impairments, cognitive impairments, and learning disabilities, photosensitivity, and multiple impairments. So when it comes then to accessibility, there are some standards where these are organized under the, and you can have like these 4 very high-level principles, and I think they are very helpful to kind of understand how to put this all into motion. They are abbreviated as POUR: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. And since the original principles read a bit technical, I lifted them from the Inclusion and Accessibility Lab's explanation because I found them a little bit more accessible. So what does perceivable mean? It means that the user must be able to understand the information being presented. It can't be invisible to any of their senses. Operable means that users must be able to use the interface, and it cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. Understandable means that users must be able to comprehend information as well as how to use the interface. And at last, robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. And this means as technologies and user agents advance and evolve, content should remain accessible. So these high-level goals are then broken down in very detailed and comprehensive checklists for all parts of digital applications like UI and widgets. And I'm not really going into that because it is comprehensive, very comprehensive. So looking at the UI of Find Me now, I can say that we definitely did not adhere to the recommendations in full. Especially the text and the button color lacked the proper contrast requirements to make it readable for people with visual impairments. Today, I would choose the colors differently. So now that we talked about disability in a sense that we are most likely familiar with, let's expand the definition so that we slowly move back from accessibility to inclusive design. Because disability was defined in the 1980s by the World Health Organization with this definition that I'm probably standing a little bit in the way of, which said that in the context of health experience, a disability is any restriction or lack of ability resulting from an impairment to perform an activity in the manner of within the range considered normal for a human being. So the fault lies with the person with the disability. They are out of the range of what is normal. But over time, this has evolved. And now, when we talk about disability, we see it more in this context-dependent sense. So disability is not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interactions between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives in. To make it a little bit clearer, disability happens at the point of interaction between a person and society. Physical, cognitive, and social exclusion is the result of mismatched interactions. Which means when we talk about societal, we sometimes call this marginalization, which often is the case for women, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ folks, and poor people. To make this a little bit more understandable, I find this very illustrative from Microsoft. We can break it down in permanent, temporary, and situational. Imagine the example of touch. A person with one arm will have a similar obstacle trying to screw open a glass of pickles like a person with a casket or a person holding a baby. So an application that we can use with only one hand will be beneficial for all of them. So this is something in mind when your PO asks you, why should we do something on top? Because it's not on top. It is part of making whatever you're doing better for everyone. So in the case of the Find Me app, the challenge for the South Sudanese in Kakuma was temporary. Because of their previous lack of exposure to smartphones, they weren't familiar with the swiping pattern. So their full capability to interact with the smartphone was, at the current moment, disabled. Because swiping was something that they could, in theory, easily learn, it was temporary. But for the success of the app, we needed to take this into consideration as a circumstance for design. Right. And before I close out, I will have to go on a small detour because while we had our helpers on the ground, it was not the same as being there and doing actual ethnographic studies, interviews, shadowings. The deeper our understanding into the situation in Kakuma grew, the more we saw how far we were away from everything, increasing the risk of intentional wrongdoings on our part. Thinking as technologists, we then ask ourselves the question every startup does when it starts to see the limits of what they might able to be achieved. Can we pivot? So at the same time we worked on that app, the Syrian humanitarian crisis was on its height. Camps were created all over Europe filled with people fleeing war, people who were much closer to us, people who could potentially visit and talk and we could collaborate with. Co-design even. So I started research into the situation and found a very helpful study that said, no, you can't. That's not what you can do because Syrian refugees are well connected by Facebook and WhatsApp, and what they actually need are things like maps for safe travel routes, translators, and stuff helping them with local bureaucracies. So the big lesson here is that even if we find surface similarities, refugees fleeing from civil war, we should never act without proper understanding of the needs of the people, especially when we're talking about vulnerable people, no matter how good our intentions. So as for the Find Me app, it got way more complex in a way that would require more and more underground presence. And we were just a dev team creating an MVP. So in the end, we found that to be really successful, we needed to have something like an NGO structure on the ground for data collection, for child safety, because the data collection would take up to 6 months for the algorithm to have enough data to actually work. So Eventually, we realized that we were in over our heads and pulled out before we risked creating damage within the vulnerable groups. And at the same time, I read this paragraph from the book Save Everything, Click Here by Yevgeny Morozov. Recasting all complex social situation either as neatly defined problem with definite computable solutions or as transparent and self-evident processes that can be easily optimized if only the right algorithms are in place. This quest is likely to have unexpected consequences that should eventually cause more damage than the problems they seek to address. And this is exactly what we did. We jumped in as tech solutionists for a tech project for good and eventually fell short of the difficulties and the real challenges. So please keep in mind, whenever you think you have a great technical solution for a societal problem, what the realistic read actually is. Maybe you discover more effective ways you could help. If such access to people on the ground is not readily available, I would advise you to check out responsible tech frameworks like the Ethical OS. There are a lot of good systems out there that might be able to help you. Or if you want to start with inclusive design here, there are some certain points from the Nielsen-Norman group. Prioritize inclusive research practices, educate stakeholders, and recognize exclusion as these three things where you could start, not end. This is not the description what to do. This is just like the baseline where you could start if you are curious about implementing this. Yeah, and this brings me to the end of my talk. And I hope I could illustrate the importance of inclusive design and maybe motivate some of you to follow this path. Remember, you don't have to be a designer. You don't even have to work in tech. Whatever you do, you can be a shaper of the culture around you. You can help to welcome those to the table who have been previously excluded from it. So in this sense, I thank you for listening.